Thank you. You may be seated. Over the years, I have been richly blessed. And it has been my privilege to travel numerous times in the mountains of these great United States. Last year we were able to take a second family vacation to the Smoky Mountains in eastern Tennessee and western North Carolina. But I remember many years ago a trip to New Hampshire. Because in New Hampshire is Mount Washington. And there's a weather station at the top of Mount Washington, and Mount Washington is the highest peak in the northeastern United States. And there's a cog railway, a steam-powered cog railway, that we rode to the top of the summit. And from the summit of Mount Washington, the views were spectacular. There's no way that I have the vocabulary to describe the beauty of the creation we were able to see. And also Mount Washington is well known for its erratic weather. And then some years ago, Norma and I, along with my mom and dad, my grandfather, traveled to Montana. And we spent some time with my aunt and uncle there. Uncle Carl and Aunt Delphine lived in Missoula. And Uncle Carl had a stable where he maintained and kept 5 beautiful pack horses. And they would actually, in the wintertime and during hunting season, Uncle Carl and others would load the pack horses with tents and supplies and go into wilderness areas of Montana where they did not even allow motorized vehicles. And they would spend a week or more or less camped out and hunting, and they would hunt for elk and they would bring it back on the pack horses. Well, it was summertime when we were there, and so there was no hunting trip planned, but Uncle Carl decided to take me and Dad and Norma up the mountains. And we decided to let us ride the pack horses up the mountains. Lila, are you and Liza getting a king-size picture of me on a horse? But we rode those horses, and Uncle Carl, as he got the horses saddled and ready to ride up the mountain, he told Norman, he told myself, he told Dad, he said, now, we're going to lay the reins over the saddle horn, and don't you dare touch those reins for anything. Because those horses were trained. Those pack horses were trained to each one follow the lead horse that Uncle Carl was riding. And on one side you could reach out, there were places you could reach out like that and touch the side of the mountain. And on the other side you could look down to infinity. Trail about this wide. And you're trusting that horse and you're trusting Uncle Carl, but we made it. We were sitting around talking about it. And Dad asked Uncle Carl, he said, how much weight can one of those horses carry when you're taking it up the mountain? He said, well, he said, you know, what the horse carries depends on the rider. He said, for example, JR, if you were riding one of the horses, they can carry about 300 pounds. If you were riding one of the horses, well, we could put the tent, some sleeping bags, or maybe some supplies on your horse. And we could take Norma's horse and we could put sleeping bags and canned goods and some of our supplies. Tim can take a raincoat. I thought that was a bit harsh, but anyway, it was probably true. But I digress. The point is, as we rode those horses up those mountain trails, the scenery was indescribable. Because you see, as I said, it was in a wilderness area. We would load the horses into Uncle Carl's trailer, drive to a parking area where that they had signs and barriers, no motorized vehicles beyond this point. Saddle up the horses and ride off. And you would see country that no one else is going to see unless they walk in there or ride a horse in there. The trails were narrow. The scenery was beautiful. And as we would get to the summit of different mountains, the beauty was indescribable. But tragically, as beautiful as the view was from the top of Mount Washington, as beautiful as the view was from the top of the mountains of Montana, you eventually have to come back down to the bottom. And yet while you're up there, you want to make it last as long as you possibly can. Because of being there and seeing that, you realize you might never again experience those images. But sooner or later, come down we must. And life goes on. That's the scene we encounter in the 9th division of the Gospel according to Mark. Jesus has been on the mountaintop with Peter and James and John. They've had a mountaintop experience spiritually with Jesus. Because Peter and James and John have seen the transfiguration of Jesus there. They say that Jesus appeared in beautiful, dazzling white. And I want you this morning to try, by an eye of faith, to visualize what it was that they saw. The glorious essence of Jesus as it was shining through. They saw Moses. They saw Elijah, the great lawgiver and forerunner for the Messiah. And they witnessed them speak with Jesus. And Peter and James and John saw the luminous cloud that enveloped all of them. It was the manifestation of the presence of God Himself. They were there. They heard the voice of the Father. They heard God say, "This is my beloved Son, listen to Him." Oh my. How badly Peter wanted that moment to last. He never wanted it to end. He said, "Lord, let's build 3 tabernacles." But they couldn't do that. They had to go back down the valley and go about their business. The spiritual high that they experienced on the mountain of transfiguration, it couldn't last forever. There was work to do. You and I have experienced mountaintop experiences in our own lives. Maybe our mountaintop experiences weren't as stupendous as those of the 3 apostles. But our mountaintop experiences were spiritual highs. Maybe it was when we were baptized. And we realized as we came up out of those waters of baptism, we had a whole world of possibilities laid before us. Because we were new creatures, washed in the blood, untarnished by stumbles along the way. Or maybe it was when we brought someone to Christ and we helped bring a new member into the family of God. Maybe it was on a mission trip somewhere where we were knocking doors in some area where the gospel was weak. But wherever it was, that mountaintop spiritual experience is going to stay with us forever. But though the experience stays with us forever, we can't stay on the mountaintop forever. We want our relationship with God to always be a high. We want our relationship with God to be characterized by fervent prayer and a deep study of the Scriptures. We want tireless good works, and we want joyful worship, and we want a sense of God's presence to be with us. But we have to come down from the mountain. So often that's so very hard. Because the mountaintops, you see, are few and far between. And they require a grueling climb to get to the top. And if we're lucky, we go down from the mountain and we find gently rolling country that we can easily navigate. But usually we find the valleys. More often than not, we don't just find a valley, we find a ditch to fall in. And sometimes that ditch feels more like the Royal Gorge than it does a ditch. What is life like in those times when we're in the ditch? What is life like when we find ourselves in the valleys of life? Those places where the sun doesn't seem to shine, and where there really seems to be no way out. What do we do when we're standing beside a newly made grave for someone who was taken far too soon? What do we do when we pray for something that doesn't come to pass? When our prayers seem dry and dusty, and we wonder, is God listening at all? More than that, in those valleys of life, sometimes we wonder, does God even care? How do we find faith when we're no longer on the mountaintop? When we can no longer hear God speak? We need guidance on what to do. I want to read from Mark chapter 9 this morning, and verses 14 and 15. When he came to his disciples, he saw a great multitude about them, and the scribes questioning with them. And straightway all the people, when they beheld him, were greatly amazed, and running to him, saluted him. Jesus and his inner circle, Peter and James and John, they came down from the mountaintop to a rude awakening, because the other 9 disciples are arguing with some of the scribes. A large crowd is gathered. Remember, the scribes were some of Jesus' greatest critics. So that in itself comes as no real surprise. But we don't know what the argument's all about. But if you look at Mark 9, 17, and 18, one of the multitude said, Master, I brought unto thee my son, who has a dumb spirit. And wheresoever he taketh him, he teareth him, and he foameth and gnasheth with his teeth, and pineth away. And I spoke to the disciples that they should cast him out, and they could not. Jesus asked the question of what's going on. And in response to Jesus' question, this man in the crowd speaks up. And it's not just any man that speaks up. It's a father. A father who's distraught over the pathetic condition of his son. Because his son is possessed by a demon. And the father has brought the son to Jesus to be healed. But Jesus was on the mountain. And the disciples, they had tried to cast out the demon, but they failed. And so that explains what all the fuss is about with the scribes. No doubt the scribes, being the enemies of Jesus, they were mocking the disciples over the miserable failure they had made of casting out the demon. And they probably even used that as a way to attack Jesus. Can you hear them? Hear the scribes. You're just a bunch of frauds. So is this man Jesus. Y'all are all just frauds. You're charlatans. Jesus' response in verse 19 tells us what's at stake in this. Jesus says, O faithless generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I suffer you? Bring you to me. Jesus is lamenting their lack of faith, and He says, how long am I going to be here? He's pained. He's exasperated. And He's exasperated more than He's saddened over their lack of faith. But then we have to ask another question. Who is Jesus exasperated with? Is it the scribes for arguing with the disciples and challenging His authority? Is it with the crowd, the multitude, including the Father, who are amazed but uncomprehending? It's with the disciples. The disciples who have too little faith to minister in the absence of Jesus. But I want you to notice the reaction of Jesus. It shows His compassion. It shows His tenderness. He doesn't look at that group of people and say, just forget it. Just forget it. No. Instead, Jesus called for the boy to be brought to Him. He said, bring him to me. What we see in this story, beloved friends, is a faith that's struggling. Mark vividly describes this boy's condition. And Mark vividly tells us just how serious the situation is. The unclean spirit sees Jesus but doesn't cry out like we've seen before. It remains silent, confirming that it causes muteness, just like the Father has said. I want you to picture this boy in all the graphic detail we find in the Bible. The demon throws his body to the ground and sends the boy into convulsions. And he rolls around on the ground, foaming at the mouth uncontrollably. And Jesus says, how long has this been happening? Almost like a physician trying to diagnose a case. And we learn it's been happening since childhood. And more than that, we learn just how incredibly dangerous a condition it is. Because this spirit not only torments this boy, this spirit tries to destroy him. It throws him into the water, into lakes and streams and rivers. It throws him into the fire. And the boy's condition, it appears to be hopeless because it's afflicted him since he was little. And think of how the Father must have felt. Think of how helpless the Father must have been. I well remember a few years ago, it was Thanksgiving. Little Hudson was just a few weeks old. And they took him to the Children's Medical Center in Dallas because that little baby was having seizures. Mason was just barely over 2, and Mason didn't realize where his mama and his little brother were. He would tell us, Mommy and Hudson are running errands. He stayed with us. And we would get pictures of little Hudson, just this tiny, frail little baby. Tubes coming out of his nose. IVs in the top of his head, IVs in his little feet, IVs in his hands. It'd break your heart to see him. And that's what this father's dealing with. His son has been having these seizures. And Dr. Luke says this was his only child. Imagine the pain of his father, watching his maimed, burnt son, wallowing in the dirt, staring up at his father with terror-filled eyes, unable to hear, to even cry out for help. No wonder the father in our story says, if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us, because this boy is completely helpless. This man hasn't just gone into the valley. This man hasn't just fallen in the ditch. He's so low he can't even look up and see sky anymore. And Jesus looks at the man and Jesus says, what do you mean, if I can? And Jesus says, if you believe. Jesus said, if you believe, all things are possible. Listen to the man's response in Mark chapter 9 and verse 24. He said, with tears in his eyes, he says, Lord, I believe. Help thou my unbelief. I believe. Help thou my unbelief. Here is an honest man. One of the most transparent men in all of the Scriptures. His faith is trembling. His faith is flawed. But his faith is real. We need to find encouragement here. Because Jesus Christ responded to that faith. Jesus rebuked the foul spirit and freed the boy from this demon. This faith, imperfect as it was, moved Jesus to action. Sometimes we beat ourselves up, don't we? Sometimes we beat ourselves up because we think our faith is not as strong as we think it should be. Because we think in our humanity that for us to be pleasing to God, we must never have any doubts. God said it, that settles it. That's the rule we want to operate with. And yet, while that's true logically, often that is small comfort to us in our pain and our uncertainty. In our lives, all of us have probably experienced a good bit of this. There have been times in all of our lives that in quiet moments of solitude we have wondered, why, God? Why is it like this? Why is all of this happening? And then we begin to feel guilty because we've questioned God, and that only serves to deepen our despair. I have a news flash for you. Are you listening? This story reminds us that it's okay to question our faith. We are not unbelievers simply because we sometimes might have doubts. The key is for us to look in the right place to alleviate those doubts. And rather than causing us to turn away from God, it should cause us to turn to God. That's what the Father did. Jesus said, if you believe, all things are possible. He looked at Jesus. He said, I do believe. Help my unbelief. He said, I believe. That's a conscious decision. And so despite his wavering, despite his uncertainty, he steps out in faith and he says, Lord, I believe. And he says to Jesus, help me believe more. And that's a recognition that he's weak. Sometimes our faith is weak, isn't it? Sometimes our faith is halting and questioning. And when it is, we are in good company. There's Job. He suffered physically, emotionally, socially, and spiritually, and he questioned God. He even accused God of afflicting him. Job struggled with the same issues that you and I face. And Job never learned the answer to his questions, but Job found God's care to be sufficient for him. There's Thomas. We call him Doubting Thomas. He gets a bad reputation as being a doubter. When the apostles came together, he wasn't there. He said, well, I'll never believe the Lord was there till I can put my hand in my fist in the side where the spear went and touch the nail prints in his hand. And yet when Thomas saw him without doing any of that, he looked at Jesus and he said, my Lord and my God. It was John the Baptist, the forerunner of Jesus from the prison cell, that sent disciples to Jesus and said, art thou he that should come, or do we look for another? Sometimes you and I find ourselves struggling in the valleys of life. We get away from the mountaintop and we wonder, what must we do to recapture that experience? We're in the valley and we struggle and we beat ourselves up for our failures and we feel guilty because of our lack of faith. And we wonder, what must we do to fix it? And we trust in our own wit, in our own wisdom, our own power, and look to ourselves for the answers. And we must realize we can accomplish nothing on our own. We must remember, as Paul said, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. What about you? What about your faith right now, right here, this morning? Have you ever come to Jesus? Have you ever made Jesus the Lord and Master of your life? If you've not, would you do that in simple, trusting faith? Repenting of everything to sin, confessing His name, and being buried in the waters of baptism? You've done that. But you're walking in the valley. Do you need to come back and say, Lord, I believe. Help me believe more. Are there needs you have that we can help you with? Whether to make Jesus Christ the Lord and Master of your life for the very first time, or renew that commitment. Whatever the needs of your life are, if we can help you with those, this is your opportunity to come and let us do that as together.